Hi, everyone. So this will be an introduction to British parliamentary debating. Um, it's okay if you're not at all familiar with British parliamentary debating. This presentation will assume that you know some of the basics about how 3v3, which is the other most common format of debating, works. But provided you know those basics, we'll be covering all parts of a BP debate, which mainly revolve around what to do in the opening half, which we'll discuss later if you haven't heard that term before, as well as the closing half. And we also will take a look at an example potential BP debate topic to apply some of the concepts that we review. So let's start with how does a BP debate work? And the way that I'm going to explain this is by distinguishing it between how a 3v3 debate works. So let's start with, I think, the biggest and most jarring difference for people who haven't seen BP debating before. And that is that there are 4 teams in British parliamentary debating. And if any point in this presentation, some of the new names or the speaking orders or things of that nature are confusing you, there's a helpful infographic in the bottom left that can act as a reference point. So if we just look at that infographic for a moment, it says government and opposition up the top. And that's similar to how in 3v3 debating, you have an affirmative team and you have a negative team. And the government, or really the affirmative side, will argue in favor of the motion and the opposition will argue against it. So if the topic was something like, we should ban zoos, the 2 government teams, which are opening government and closing government, would have to provide reasons as to why banning zoos would be a good idea. And the 2 opposition teams, which are opening opposition and closing opposition, would have to provide reasons why banning zoos would be a bad idea. Now, even though there are 2 teams on each bench or each side when we talk about the government and the opposition, that doesn't mean that those teams are not competing against one another. So it's not as if you have 4 speakers and they're all kind of working together. There are still 4 teams, which means, as we'll discuss later, for example, the closing government team is trying to find a way to beat the opening government team as well as the 2 opposition teams. So opening opposition and closing opposition. And we'll talk a little bit now about how it is you actually win a BP debate and how it is you're able to beat other teams in a BP debate. So let's start again by talking about how you win a debate in 3v3 debating. And that's when, if you're on the affirmative or the negative team, you're able to basically win the important issues in the debate and convince the adjudicator that overall you provided better argumentation than the other team. Now, in BP debating, it's sort of similar in that you are attempting to explain to the adjudicator why your argument or your contribution is more important than anything any other team has said. So you might, as opening government, try to provide arguments that are the best arguments for why you should agree with this policy. And so if opening government was going to beat opening opposition, and closing government, they would have to defeat the arguments coming from the opposition teams, but they would also have to provide a better justification for the motion than closing government. And if that seems a little bit strange, that's okay. We'll discuss specifically what type of arguments to make at opening and what types of arguments to make at closing. And we'll talk how closing teams can beat their opening teams later in the presentation. The basic thing that you need to understand now is that phrase, you are trying to provide the best reason to vote for your side of the motion. So if that makes sense, then that's all that you need to understand at this point in the presentation. One quick side note about British parliamentary debating before we continue is that unlike 3v3, you only receive 15 minutes of prep time. And we'll talk about maybe what to do in those 15 minutes and how to make the most out of them later in the presentation. But the simple reason for this is that if the opening teams had 30 minutes prep, they would probably have too big of an advantage over closing teams. Because, as we'll reveal later, closing teams aren't allowed to make the same arguments as their opening teams. And so the reason why you have less prep is to constrain you in the amount of arguments you can make so that there's enough arguments for everyone out there. And whether or not a team wins is more about how well they can make an argument and how persuasively they can weigh that argument as well as respond to other teams. So that's an overview of what a BP debate would look like. In that we've covered kind of what a government team would look like and an opposition team would look like. And as you can see in the infographic, the specific progression of the debate would start with the opening government team, which has, and we'll discuss these in a minute, a prime minister and a deputy prime minister. And it would start, we go prime minister speaks, leader of the opposition speaks. And as you can see from the diagram there and the numbering, it kind of also shows you the ordering of the debate. Let's then move to what does a team in the opening half do? And the good thing about opening half and BP is that it is not too dissimilar from a regular 3v3 debate. There are some more subtle differences that we might discuss in this presentation and that you'll become aware of if you do British parliamentary debating. But for now, the simple thing to understand is what each speaker's main role is and what types of things should be at the forefront of your mind. So let's start with what the Prime Minister does. And this is as you can see from the infographic, the first speaker from the opening government team. And their job is very similar to a first affirmative speaker. They'll provide any necessary setup in order to clarify the debate, provide a model potentially, clarify any important characterization, and then they'll deliver their substantive arguments where they will mechanize them in the same ways you would in 3v3. They will impact them and they will weigh them in the same ways you would as in 3v3. Following a prime minister's speech, the leader of the opposition, which is the first speaker of the opening opposition team, will first of all respond to the prime minister in the way that a first negative might, but their focus is still, like a first negative, to deliver the important substantive arguments and contributions from their team. Following the leader of the opposition, we have the deputy prime minister. They may add new substantive if they wish. And in BP debating, you can think of the deputy prime minister like a second affirmative, in that they need to get up, they need to respond to what the opposite team has just said, and they can, if they wish, provide some new substantive. Now, often in 3v3, providing new substantive is not as important as it is in British parliamentary debating. And that's because generally in 3v3, the team's most important arguments and what will likely decide the debate often comes out in the first affirmative and first negative speeches. However, in British parliamentary debating, because as we've discussed, there may be arguments that you haven't thought of in prep or you didn't have the time to make. And since those arguments could be taken by your closing teams, it is more useful at deputy to try and give new reasons, even if you don't give an entirely new argument. But if you can, new arguments and new reasons for why overall you will have had the greatest impact on the debate. Now, that doesn't mean that the Deputy Prime Minister or the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, for that matter, who we'll get to in a moment, should neglect rebuttal. Rebuttal is still a very important role of deputies. All I'm emphasizing here is that many second affirmative and second and negative speakers would consider substantive as a very last priority and something that really isn't going to be that influential in winning a round. Whereas in BP, for opening teams, the deputy speakers, so the deputy prime minister and the deputy leader of the opposition, can have quite a large impact on the debate by running new substantive arguments. If for no other reason, then it makes the job of their closing, which for opening government would be closing government, and for opening opposition would be closing opposition, just that bit more difficult. And since we're competing as a team in BP against every other team in the debate, it's not just an argument that is another reason why maybe the other opening team is wrong, but it's also an argument that, as we've said, therefore your closing cannot deliver. Now, another thing I'll remind you, well, not remind, but I'll state, is that since we are in BP as a team, constantly trying to explain to an adjudicator why we have made the most important argument, a large role of the deputy speakers in the opening half is to weigh their arguments very clearly and very explicitly. And this is something that in 3v3 is obviously encouraged by a second speaker, but it is something that if you neglect to do it second in 3v3 debating, you might not necessarily lose a debate of. And that being said, you won't instantly lose a BP debate if you don't do this. But remember that there's going to be 28 minutes of additional speeches with 4 other speakers once you finish as the opening half. So it's probably very, very useful to make it clear to the adjudicator why, if your points are true, they affect, for example, a very large number of people. They might be very likely arguments, so the adjudicator should perhaps favor them. They might be arguments that occur very frequently, or they might be arguments that affect people individually to a very large scale. And so pointing out things like that is a very useful way to ensure that even if closing teams come up with new arguments that you hadn't have thought of, there's still a burden on them to explain why they are more important than the sets of reasons and pieces of weighing that you have already given and already told the adjudicator. Now, most of the things I've said about Deputy Prime Minister also apply to Deputy Leader of the Opposition, which is the second speaker from the opening opposition team. They may, and it's useful if they deliver new substantive arguments or provide new reasons, and their job is to respond to the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. Now that we've covered that, that is largely all that occurs in an opening half. And hopefully you're sitting here thinking, that seems pretty manageable. It's not too different from BP. There's just a slightly greater need to perhaps insert some new substantive arguments or insert a couple of new reasons for the arguments you've already given, if you can do that. And there's also a importance of doing explicit, clear weighing, which for most experienced 3v3 debaters should seem pretty natural and shouldn't seem that daunting. So what we'll do now is we'll discuss the much more complicated part of BP debating, which is the closing half. And that's when closing government and closing opposition get up to speak. So what actually happens in a closing half? Well, the easiest way to start is to think and make reference to what has already happened. There's already been 2 teams, the opening government, who is supporting the motion, and the opening opposition, who is opposing the motion, deliver some substantive arguments and discuss a number of important ideas in the debate. When a closing team gets up, their main job is to provide a new argument, and there are different types of arguments that we'll discuss in a moment, but one of those new arguments, and have that be their contribution that the adjudicator assesses as to why they have, provided substantial reasoning as to why, if you're closing government, you should agree with the motion, and if you're closing opposition, why you should disagree with the motion. Now, importantly, closing teams have 2 speakers. They have what's called a member. So for closing government, that is the member of government, and for closing opposition, that is the member of opposition. These are the only speakers who can insert new material in the debate in the closing half. And the analogy to 3v3 debating is in the same way that third speakers cannot add new material because often it is too difficult for the other team to respond to. That's the same type of principle here. So if you are a closing team and you have an argument that you want to insert into the debate as your contribution, it must be fully delivered by your member. The other speaker in the closing half is the whip. So as you can see from the picture, there's a government whip who is in the closing government team, and there is an opposition whip who is in the closing opposition team. We'll talk about their job in a minute, but they do not deliver new substantive material. Similar, but different to a third speaker, their job is to defend the argument that their closing team has made and respond to the other teams in the debate. Now, importantly, the government whip speakers don't have an obligation to defend their opening team's material. And that's because you're still competing against them. So just because you're on the same side or on the same bench doesn't mean that you need to defend your openings material. All you have to do is not directly contradict it. So now what we're going to do is take a small pause on what whip speakers do and talk about what members do, which is the new substantive that's being delivered. And that's often the most difficult, but it's also the most important part of what a closing team in BP debating does. The first thing I'll talk about is that there are broadly two types of arguments that closing teams can give. The first is what are called vertical extensions. The word extension here is really just a BP term that means argument. And in this case, what the word vertical means is you can think of it almost like a graph. You're adding depth. And so the reason it is a vertical extension, as we'll see in a moment, is because you're not necessarily making a claim that is not previously been discussed. But what you are doing is you're giving new reasons to believe why that claim is true. The other type of extension or argument that closing teams can make is what is called a horizontal extension. And this is where you add new arguments and new material that have not been said in the debate yet. Before we go on to talking about how do you make those arguments more specifically, there are two things that you should note as to what closing teams are not allowed to do. The first thing you are not allowed to do in order to be credited with having your own argument and your own contribution is you cannot be derivative. And what this means is that if your opening says an argument or gives a piece of rebuttal, you cannot just re-say it word for word, or you can't re-say it without adding anything new. So if opening government on the debate we should ban zoos says that this is really like zoos are really evil and immoral, for example, we think that you should let animals roam free. If closing government got up and said, we should let animals roam free and we think it's immoral to have them constrained, that would be a derivative argument because closing government has not added anything new to that, and it is fundamentally the same argument. And derivative arguments are heavily penalized in BP debating. Almost always, even a very well-made and very well-said derivative argument will lose to a less well-made, less convincing, but new, novel argument from another closing team. And so, particularly because you have to compete against 3 other teams when you're at closing, then you want to make sure that you don't have a derivative extension because you'll almost always never be able to beat the 2 opening teams who have new and novel arguments. And unless the other closing team is also very derivative, you'll likely lose to them too. The other important rule to note about closing teams is that they are not allowed to knife their opening team. And what this means is that they are not allowed to directly contradict or rebut what their opening team has said. So closing government cannot provide analysis or arguments that directly rebut or directly contradict what opening government have said. They are, of course, able to provide arguments that disagree with opening opposition, since they are on a different side of the motion, and opening opposition is not closing government's opening. Your opening as a closing team refers to the team in the opening half that was on the same side of the topic as you. So the opening of closing opposition would be opening opposition. And as we've said, the opening of closing government would be opening government. Now, as we'll discuss later, you can suggest that an argument made by your opening was not the best argument in the debate, but you cannot do that by giving reasons as to why their argument is wrong. There are other helpful tips and tricks that we'll discuss, but that is the key thing to focus on for now. Firstly, don't be derivative. And secondly, ensure that you do not directly contradict what your opening has said. And one final note is that you cannot not only contradict their arguments, but you cannot contradict their model. So closing teams are not allowed to remodel the debate. So if opening opposition on the topic we should ban zoos said that instead of banning zoos, we will improve their animal practices and we'll make sure they're more ethically handled, closing opposition could not say, we will not do that. We will instead do something else. That would be a knife. And knives are also heavily penalized in BP debating. So you should avoid doing those. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about vertical extensions. The first thing to remember is what we said earlier, which is that a vertical extension is when you are giving new reasons to prove an argument made by your opening. And you may be wondering, when should I run a vertical extension? And generally, there are two things that need to happen in the opening half part of the debate in order for a vertical extension to be a viable option. The first thing that needs to happen is you need to ensure that your opening has given somewhat subpar reasons. And that is because if an opening team provides lots of good reasons, even if you also provide good reasons, then you're not really having a large impact on the debate. In other words, your contribution is not very important in whether or not the adjudicator credits the argument, because the argument was already very well made. And so if the adjudicator believes you give lots of good reasons, but they already in large part believe the argument, then they would not credit you for them believing the argument. They would credit the reasons that their opening gave that already caused them to believe that that was a good argument made by the government bench. So the second thing you need to ensure is that provided your opening has not given great reasons, in your opinion, for why an argument is true, you also need to ensure that it is an important point of discussion in the opening half. And if it is not, you need to be able to make it an important point of discussion. What this really means is that you need to be able to explain why this was a very important argument, but it was not made well enough for you to credit it. However, you as the adjudicator, however, now that the argument has been made properly by, let's say, closing government, you as the adjudicator can now actually credit that very important argument that will now win the debate. And this may seem daunting at first, but all this is suggesting is that you don't just provide new reasons and sit down. You still, like any other argument, need to mechanize that argument, need to weigh that argument, and need to explain why that argument is a very useful analytic contribution to the debate. In terms of how you would go about structuring a vertical extension, there are broadly 4 things you need to do. The first is that you should identify what reasons your opening gave. So suppose you are closing government, you would probably start by saying, I'm going to provide a vertical extension that explains why the argument made by opening government, which is X, is true. And then you would go, the reasons that opening government gave for this argument were, and then you would list them. The second thing you would do is you would explain why they were not sufficient to prove the point or to have the adjudicator believe the claim. And you cannot do this, as we have discussed, by directly rebutting your opening. So closing government could not get up and say opening government provided 2 reasons. Here is new rebuttal as to why they are wrong. That would be illegitimate, as it would be a knife. However, what you are allowed to do is you are allowed to frame that argument differently made by your opening, and you're able to point out whether the opening on the other side of the debate, so in this case, closing government, could point out that opening opposition makes a valid critique of opening government's point that they do not respond to. And so the idea here is that you're attempting to find a way to explain to the adjudicator why the argument made at opening is not great without directly rebutting them yourselves. And so you might be able to explain that based on their reasons, they can only claim 1 or 2 small impacts. But with your reasons, you can claim much more important impacts in a debate, much more often, for example. Now, obviously, after you have explained both what your opening's reasons were, and secondly, why they were not sufficient, you should then provide your new reasons as to why the argument made by your opening is actually true. And you would do that the way you would provide reasons for any other argument. You would set them out firstly, secondly, thirdly, as you are used to. The final thing that you do at the end of a vertical extension is you explain why that argument is the most important contribution in the round, which, as we've discussed, largely involves impacting and weighing. I'll note now that you can run as many extensions as you want at closing, but it is generally recommended that you only run 1 to 2. Because once you start running more than that, you'll often find, as we'll discuss later, that you won't have adequate time to cover all of the necessary steps of a vertical or a horizontal extension if you try to do too many, particularly because speeches in BP are only 7 minutes and at max 7:15, as opposed to 3v3 debating, where they are 8 minutes with a max of 8:15. So that is the broad overview of vertical extensions. And if you remember nothing else, remember the vertical extension requires your opening to not give good reasons and to not have already proven why an argument is true. If you think an opening team has done their job very well and they've given lots of sophisticated reasons, and you can only think of maybe 1 or 2 new reasons to add, neither of which are significantly better and neither of which really address a problem in the way that your opening has argued, because perhaps there isn't one, you should instead turn to what are called horizontal extensions. But before we do that, we're just going to go through a brief example. So suppose the topic is that we should tax companies that heavily pollute. Opening government might say that this will deter companies from polluting. And at closing government, you may argue that opening government says that they will deter polluting, but does not provide any reasons. And that is not rebutting your opening. It is a true observation about the way that they have argued. And you may say, therefore, it's difficult to credit this claim being made well to opening government. However, you could provide reasons such as that because companies are profit motivated, they will not want to lose revenue and will switch to green alternatives, which is a new reason that proves that companies will no longer pollute, which is a very important claim in the round. So let's then talk about what we call horizontal extensions. And I'll remind you of what we discussed earlier, which is that a horizontal extension is when you add an argument that had not previously been discussed in the debate. Suppose the topic is also that we should tax companies that heavily pollute. If opening government correctly identifies that this may disincentivize companies from polluting since it will increase their operation costs, making business more expensive unless they switch to renewables, then you might not be able to add a new reason that proves the argument significantly better, since it's already been made at least somewhat decently. Instead, at closing government, you might argue that this will generate governments a large amount of revenue, and they can use that to address important issues. And you might extend that to things beyond the environment, things like healthcare, things like the economy. So a good way to think about whether or not to run a horizontal extension is to think, can I come up with a more important argument than what my opening has discussed? And if you can, then it is generally suggested to run a horizontal extension, even if you can also think of how to make an extension vertical. And the reason for that is because it ensures that you are definitely not being derivative. So if at any point you have 3 extensions, 2 of them are horizontal and 1 of them are vertical, provided that you think the 2 horizontal ones might be as or equally good as the vertical, you should probably default to those 2 horizontal extensions. It is, of course, fine to have a mix of both. That is, you might add 1 new substantive argument that is a horizontal extension at the member of either closing government or closing opposition. And you might, in addition to that, try to beat your opening and overall win the opening half discussion by also adding some additional explanations for an argument that you think is really important. However, the key takeaway is that since being derivative is bad, you want to ensure that if you're going to run a vertical extension, you do it very well and you don't neglect any of the important facets that we talked about earlier. What we'll now do is we'll now talk about whip speeches. And again, we'll start by considering what's already occurred in the debate. What's occurred thus far is that there's been an opening half discussion and there's also been 2 member speeches. So if you're the government whip, your member of government has provided your extension, and then the member of opposition has provided their team's extension. And you as the whip have to do a few things. The first and most important thing that you must do is defend your team's extension. If nothing else, make sure that the adjudicator believes that the rebuttal offered to your extension doesn't work and that it weighs very highly. And the reason for that is because that will be your most novel and strong contribution in the majority of BP debates. And so if your strongest contribution has been defended and has been adequately framed and weighed with respect to all the other teams, where you compare your extension to the extensions and arguments of the opening teams and the other closing team, then you've done a good job at whip. However, it is also useful to not just defend your argument, but explain why arguments that other teams have made are not important contributions. If we're talking about arguments made by the other bench, so suppose again you are closing government, you are allowed to directly rebut the arguments of opening opposition and closing opposition, the same way you would rebut the other team in 3v3 debating. And it is generally advised that you start by defending your extension for ideally the first 1 to 2 minutes of your speech. However, if you require more time, that is, of course, okay. These are not strict rules or guidelines. Secondly, you should probably address the other closing team. And that's for the simple reason that there's already been a lot of back and forth between the two opening teams, and a lot of those arguments have already been litigated. The newest argument that has received the least response will be that made by your other closing team. And so you want to ensure that even if you don't think it's a great argument, you at least address it enough that it is not able to beat you by virtue of just being unresponded to, particularly because you know that there will be an opposition whip speaker or a government whip speaker, depending on whether you're at closing government or closing opposition, that will defend their extension and explain its importance and try to make it seem like the most important contribution. After you have defended your extension and responded to the other closing team, you generally want to talk about the opening team on your diagonal. What that means is that if you're closing government, your diagonal is opening opposition. And if you are closing opposition, your diagonal is opening government. And again, you can adjust the timing depending on how well you think opening opposition is done. So if you think opening opposition has done an exceptional job and closing opposition has done a poor job, you mightn't spend too much time on closing and a lot more time on opening. But the general idea is that you will, as a whip speaker, defend your extension and then broadly address the other bench as a whole. And there are lots of different ways to do whip structures, but the most common one is for people to just say what I've said by going, firstly, I will defend our extension. Secondly, I will respond to closing opposition's extension. Thirdly, I'll respond to opening opposition. And then, as you may have guessed, fourthly, I'll respond to opening government. And that's what it would sound like if you were the government whip speaker, probably in your introduction. Now, you should note two important things. The first is that if you've responded to the other bench and you're now responding to your opening, you are, again, not allowed to explain why their arguments are wrong and therefore why your arguments are more important. That is, you cannot directly rebut them. Instead, what you often need to do is you need to identify a limitation to the way they've made their argument. So perhaps the types of impacts that your opening goes for are very short term. Perhaps they are speculative. Those are not direct pieces of rebuttal, but those are ways that you can weigh that argument out of the debate. And so by using a variety of weighing techniques and by observing the types of impacts and the logical shortcomings of an argument without adding new rebuttal, you as a whip speaker, and you could also do this at the member of government, however, it's less of a priority, or the member of opposition, however, again, it's less of a priority. You as a whip speaker, so either government whip or opposition whip, need to explain why your argument is more important than also your openings. And at this point, you should think, I've actually probably done a good job because I've defended the contribution that I've given, and I've individually assessed all the other contributions in the debate and have explained why ours is the most important. Another thing to keep in mind at whip is that you should not be derivative in your rebuttal. So in the same way that you can be derivative when you make substantive claims, like whether or not an argument is new or has a new component to it, you also will not be awarded points if you simply use the same rebuttal provided by your opening. So if opening government rebuts opening opposition by saying X, you pointing out X does not help you. It only helps opening government. And so another important thing to do at Government Whip is to explain why the way that you have engaged with the other teams in this debate, or at least the teams on the other bench, might be better than the way that your opening has engaged with them. And if you're sitting here thinking, this seems like it's a lot to do, you're correct. And these things do feel more natural over time. But that's also why you're only given 15 minutes as an opening team. And as a closing team, why you have a lot more time to think critically as the debate emerges. The final thing I'll encourage everyone to keep in mind about whip speeches is that whip speeches need to ensure that they don't focus on every single reason given by another team. And that's because there's 6 other speakers not on your team, and 6 times 7 is 42. And it's very, very unlikely that you can address 42 minutes worth of material in 7 minutes, even if your member does some of the rebuttal as well. And so what you should attempt to do is identify the most important contributions, and those are probably the contributions that teams have spent the most amount of time on. And within those, the most important mechanisms or reasons they've given as to why those arguments are true. So if opening government makes one argument and they spend 5 minutes explaining one reason and 1 minute explaining another 2, at closing opposition, you probably want to focus on why the biggest reason for why their one argument is wrong. And so a big skill in being a whip speaker in a British parliamentary debate is being able to identify how the debate is progressing and what you think would be important in the minds of the adjudicator, and making strategic decisions about what is worth addressing in your speech and what is not worth addressing. And that's often why when people want to become very good whip speakers, they spend a lot of time doing adjudicating. Because in the same way that third speeches in 3v3 are almost like a mini adjudication with some rebuttal offered, whip speakers similarly assess each team's contribution in the way that an adjudicator would. They simply provide rebuttal or provide weighing to try and skew it in favor of their team. Now that we've established that, that is really the crux of BP debating. There are lots of other tips and tricks that you'll learn, types of arguments to make sure you remember to run if you've seen a motion before. However, the strategy and the way that the positions work doesn't change. And that's definitely the part of BP that differs most from 3v3 debating, that takes the most amount of time to get used to. The only other thing that this presentation will address then is what are called POIs, or points of information, which are in some 3v3 formats allowed, but not always. Whereas in BP debating, they are allowed. What is a POI to start with? A POI is when you offer a perhaps critique or a question to another team. Now, you cannot POI someone on your same bench. So opening government cannot POI closing government and vice versa. Similarly, opening opposition cannot POI closing opposition and vice versa. You begin by offering a POI between the 1st and 6th minute of a speech. So that means until the 1st minute, and from the 6th until the 7th minute, you are not allowed to offer them, and you will be penalized for doing so. The idea being that those speakers have what's called protected time, and that they are not constantly bombarded by people saying point. And on that note, the way that you offer a POI is by saying point, and often putting your hand up to indicate that you would like the speaker who is speaking to take you. You do not get to just interrupt people and ask a question. You must first be called on by that speaker saying something like, I will take your POI. And so be careful. A very easy way to get penalized in BP debating and to be considered a bit of a rude debater is to interrupt people and start asking your POI without them first accepting you. A couple of other things to note about POIs is that you can offer them every 15 seconds or more, which means that when you offer a POI, if a speaker chooses not to take you by perhaps waving you down or saying no thank you, you must wait 15 seconds before you offer again. The idea being that you shouldn't be badgering someone or disrupting the debate by constantly going point, 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 because it disrupts the flow of the other person's speech. The final important thing to note about how POIs work with respect to the rules is that they cannot be more than 15 seconds. So it would obviously be quite unfair if you took up 5 minutes of someone's speech by asking a very long-winded POI. So after 15 seconds, you as the person receiving the POI are entitled to say you're out of time and address their POI. And the adjudicator, should you keep going over 15 seconds, might also call order in the debate and ask you to stop speaking. However, equally, it means that another speaker who is receiving the POI cannot cut you off before 15 seconds. And it is considered very poor form to not let someone ask their POI if they have not exceeded their time. Now, that is how POI exchanges work. In sum, between 1 and 6 minutes, you say point. If called upon, you may ask a 15-second question, which the other team who is receiving the POI is expected to address. So your natural next inclination might be to ask, but what should I ask in these POIs? And there are two broad things you want to do. The first thing you can do is you can attempt to point out a very fundamental flaw in the other team's case. And if the adjudicator believes that, or if the speaker is unable to respond to it, then it might help explain to the adjudicator why you have a more important contribution. And the key word there is fundamental. It's not very useful in POIs to rebut one of maybe a team's 4 or 5 mechanisms, because you've really just put a dent in their argument rather than unraveling it, which is what we should attempting to do with POIs. So if, for example, another team relies on a very particular characterization and all of their benefits are contingent on that, asking a POI which maybe clarifies why that characterization might not be accurate or might be wrong is an example of perhaps unraveling a team's case rather than just offering a counter assertion. The other thing to note is that in a POI, you can also attempt to explain why your material is the most important without necessarily unraveling another team's argument, but rather by reminding the team, and also more importantly, the adjudicator, of why your material might still stand and might still be more important. And therefore, even if what they're saying is true, it's insufficient to beat the contributions that you've provided. Now, every team in BP is expected to take 2 POIs across both speakers. And theoretically, you could have, for example, member of government take 2 POIs and government whip take none. But it is also generally expected that each speaker takes at least 1 POI. And that's less of a hard rule, but it is by norm and convention something that most adjudicators will prefer you do. And in BP, if you refuse to take a POI, you are also penalized for that. And in many BP debates, teams that are very close, and the call could go either way for voting for maybe opening opposition could get the second and closing government could maybe get the third, that call and comparison might switch around depending on which team offers more POIs. And the final thing that I'll say there is that generally, it is strategic to offer a POI to the team on your diagonal. So if you're opening government, you probably spend a lot of time addressing and engaging the material that opening opposition provided. And so when you're debating, it's useful to take POIs from closing opposition because you won't have a direct chance to rebut them. And equally, since closing opposition is going to spend a lot of time addressing closing government, it's also expected that they provide opening government the chance to engage and offer them some POIs. Now, if your diagonal doesn't offer you a POI, but the team either in your opening or your closing does, so let's say you're at opening government, closing opposition doesn't offer you a POI, but opening opposition does, or equally you're at closing government and opening opposition doesn't offer you a POI, but closing opposition does, you're well within your rights to take the POIs that have been offered. You can't force a team to offer a POI, and you won't be penalized for not taking a POI from your diagonal if it was not offered. However, for the reasons I've already pointed out, it is useful for the purposes of engagement and knowing what the other team is going to run, or perhaps sneaking in some of your rebuttal before your opening team says it, as meaning that you should take from your diagonal. That is the end of the presentation. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand some of the ways that BP debating differs from 3v3 debating. It's perfectly natural if you feel like you need to rewatch this video, or if some of the concepts initially don't make a lot of sense. And that is the reaction that every single person when they first encounter BP debating is. And so hopefully this seminar has pointed out some of the ways in which it's different and you understand them a little bit better now. But even if you're not feeling super confident, the best way to get better at BP is to practice, because you'll have a room full of supportive people and adjudicators that can provide you feedback. Everyone is very empathetic to the struggle of switching from 3v3 to BP. And so when you're first starting out, do some BP debates. And equally, if you ever get confused, I would say the part of BP debating that most confuses people is closing. So if you're finding that you're continually struggling from that, rewatching the part of this presentation about what closing teams do and how vertical and horizontal extensions differ from one another, when you should probably run one compared to the other, and the components that make up each of those extensions are the things that you should try to most familiarize yourself with and upskill yourself on. But with that said, that concludes the presentation. Thank you.